Kia ora, Wanju Wanju Nija, Nungabuja. Welcome to the land of the Noongar. When we speak about change, we always have to speak about changing language. There's always old language that we need to respect, but there's also old language we need to change. There's new ways of doing things. And I think one of the things I want to talk to you about really is that digital change that we're seeing, which is changing the economy, which is really driving the uptake of lithium. If I move forward, no, that one, bottom one. That looks like me. You can see I'm addicted to digital, so you'll find me anywhere on the web if you go searching. I'm also attached with the University of Western Australia, but I run a business called FutureSmart. And what we try and do is imagine the future. How do markets change when new technologies arrive? What happens to broker that change through? This is one of my most favourite pictures on the planet, because this is a depiction of the digital economy. Everybody throw your hands in the air and wiggle your fingers. That's the digital economy, and that's exactly what we're seeing in this image. Not only are we on a sea of change, we're heading in a direction that's determined by where those digital fingers take us, but that's also the millennials. Because this economy, this new economy, isn't going to be shaped by the baby boomers anymore. This new digital economy is going to be shaped by the new consumers who are millennials, who, despite what some of us grey-hairs think about them, are in fact far more sustainable, far more responsible than we ever were. That may scare some people, but it's true. The other part of what I talk about is prediction of the future, and of course the old saying from Niels Bohr that prediction is difficult, especially if it's about the future, but we're going to give a bit of that today. Here's the alternative image. This is what we're leaving behind. This is the old dinosaur monster of the energy utility industry. And this monster is indeed on its way out. How do we know? We know because over history of our economy, we've collected data. And as scientists in this room will appreciate, that collecting data is fundamental to understanding how change happens. And what we know from that, through Rogers S-curve, is we get an early start-up phase, we go into a much faster take-up, and we reach a peak of what consumption is. Now, consumption can be varied. In this room, only about everybody's seated, and there's a surplus of seats. We probably didn't need as many seats as we needed. We can track this on that curve. Some of us may need assistance in walking. There might be a walking cane. You only need as much walking canes in a room as is needed by the people that need them. So these sorts of curves talk about the market and the market capacity. And it's important to understand how that works. And as new products enter a marketplace, click it in the right place, we also get an exit. There is always an exit. As a new technology enters, the old one leaves. Now, I always have to ask this room, there will be two people. Who's still got a flip phone? Nobody. Oh, that's very advanced crowd. There's usually at least still two. But most of us have moved on to smartphones. The old technology has left the building. And so we need to think about how that works. And when we do that, many of you may have seen this spaghetti diagram before, and it just tracks a whole pile of different technologies. And the primary lesson on this board and from Rogers S-curve is none of this is linear. None of it's a flat curve into the future. It's a big curve up into the past, and then it dominates and it finishes. And so whatever that technology has been, we've seen this transition go on. And if we start to stack these up in a different way, what we know is that this technology adoption goes faster and faster. As we move through the century, as we move through the decades, we actually see faster adoption rates of technology. That's fundamentally important to understand what's going to happen with lithium and batteries and all the battery materials and all the new energy materials. So we need to think about how that moves forward. Accenture came up with a new idea. Rogers S-curve is the grey part in the background there, but Accenture called it the Big Bang Theory, or the shark fin. The idea that we now have to have a different paradigm to describe the economy of the 21st century, because Rogers S-curve really described the economy of the 20th century, but is not up to the task of describing where we're at today. Change is inevitable, change will always happen, and the way we describe change needs to adapt as well. So we have to take that forward, moving forward. So, the impossible part is, I'm telling you that when we move to the future, it's going to be this steep. But just like you, I'm mortal. Just like you, I don't have a working crystal ball. The one that I have is a fake. But if we all look into the future, actually all we can see is the point of reference of time that we have. And that point in time reference very often persuades us that change is not possible. That point of reference time says the only information I have is the past, and I look backwards and it looks like it's linear. It doesn't look like that very fast trajectory. And as a scientist, the one thing I need to tell you about the future is if you've got data about the past, you can probably just about throw it away. Long data sets aren't going to tell you what the future looks like. Short data sets may help you understand how quick the rate of change is. And so as you can see, you can build different slopes from long data sets and short data sets. Now, fundamentally, I trained as a scientist. Throw data away? What are we saying? This is nonsense. But if we're going to think about how the future changes, we need to think about the immediacy of data. We need to think about the data that is today and the recent past that informs us about how quickly the change has already started to occur. Old data sets don't help us with that. That's a real problem. And amongst all of that, we have to remember there's always an exit. With every new commodity entry, there's always an exit. So, and here's a simple example. Here's the flip phone example. You can throw a whole pile of Kodak moments up there. This is one of those Kodak moments where Nokia, 1 billion customers. Can anyone catch the cell phone king? The answer is yes. They did. They're gone. So we know that this change is inevitable, and in our modern economy we can track it. So we've got Rogers S-curve. Here's a huge, great shopping list that I'm not going to talk through about where all the change is going to occur. But the fundamental lesson on this slide really is last century was a different economy. Last century was what I call command and control, what we all call command and control. But this century is very much, because of this little device here, is suggest and choose. We now interact with the supplier of our goods in a way that we never imagined. And that is extraordinarily powerful. You may have heard the phrase consumer democracy. What consumer democracy does is it pushes governments, but more particularly it pushes businesses to be better custodians, because their customers will let them know in no uncertain terms if they fail that test. So there's a whole range of changes that are coming, all of which are related to the convergence of technology, all of which are related to the delivery of innovation, all of which are embedded in the digitalisation of our economy, and most of all fundamentally underwritten by mobility. So that means mobile devices, and mobile devices means batteries. And it's also underwritten by a consumer-led revolution that suggests and choose that drives the supply chain from the bottom up. Okay, so let's start assembling that into what stuff might look like. It's an exciting time in the clean tech space. Renewables are going through the roof. If you had a bit of, a future of renewables, this is contemporary data up to 2017. This is how much wind capacity has been built on the planet. This is how much solar capacity has been built on the planet. Those curves are most certainly non-linear. Those curves are most certainly pretty exciting. But guess what? We're standing at a point in time and we can't see the steep curve in front of us. If we did look forward at that steep curve and start to model where the future might be with renewables, we've only just started. So the real growth is just about to happen. And that real growth, you can see, wind was fast. Solar's faster again. This is just same as we've seen on all those other technologies. Each technology that comes subsequent to the last one comes faster. And in my argument, batteries will be faster again. And that's because we've actually pre-prepared the conditions for a grand success of batteries. You'll also see on this little graph an entry of solar thermal, which later in the piece, in my view, gets rather much larger, but that's just the start of solar thermal. How does this all happen? Scale and volume. If you can scale up the product and deliver volume, then you'll hit the economic paradigm that every time you double manufacturing capacity, you'll improve efficiency in the range of about 8 to 22%. When you scale up an operation, it becomes more efficient. You have learnings, you have better efficiency on your supply chain, you have better logistics, you get to reiterate your product, and so the product production gets more efficient, and so there is a natural improvement over time of production that reduces cost. And as you scale that up into volume, you get even greater economies of scale. And that's reflected in this curve of reducing cost of solar with increasing volume. And we can do the same as we look at the production of batteries. But batteries is something we've actually been producing for a long, long time. This record only goes back to 2005. But as of 2017, the world had already produced over 130 gigawatt hours of batteries in 1 year. That's actually just my data on consumption on major devices. That's not all of the batteries in the world, it's just most of the batteries in the world. And as we scale up that volume of batteries, we should also expect a diminishment of price. Now, my curve is just a little bit different to Bloomberg's. If you've seen the Bloomberg curve, I've already got batteries falling to $100 a kilowatt hour by 2020. Elon Musk might prove me wrong this year. We'll have to wait for the market data next year. But Bloomberg suggests that 100 kilowatt hour, 100 price per kilowatt hour, $100 a kilowatt hour won't come until 2025. I think that's crazy nuts. If we simply look at the data trend line, and actually assume that that data trend line will head into the future, then it cannot help but be $100 by 2020. Here's a different way to think about things, and that is that we're changing the way we consume energy. Last century we required a great big coal-fired power station somewhere in the back of Bourke to generate, or Hazelwood or some other collie location. This century we've actually commoditised energy. And so 2 years ago we started producing more solar panels, big black flat devices that produce energy, more solar panels than we make TV sets, which are big black devices that consume energy. So we've actually moved from having a commodity that consumes energy to a commodity that makes energy. So solar and energy that's related to it is just a consumer commodity these days in a way that it wasn't in the past. In the past we were reliant on somebody else giving it to us. Today we can own it and make that power ourselves. That's a fundamental shift in the way that we think about energy. Those of us that have solar on our rooftops are in fact playing in this game. Here's this shocking list again. The primary question for us is, how does this then all relate to the consumption of batteries, of intake of renewable energy, of delivery of electric vehicles, of all the other components that come with this new economy? Lithium by end use in 2017, you can see that batteries are only about a quarter of consumption. 3/4 of consumption is in fact in other places. And you can see in all of that, that in fact of all the battery consumption, the majority of that battery consumption is in portable devices, computers, laptops, smartphones, power tools, all that kind of stuff. EVs, as of last year, have got about 6% of that lithium consumption going into batteries. Still fairly early days. And storage is yet to start. Storage in an electric car is far more valuable than storage at home. Our price for electricity is low enough that battery storage isn't as economic as using electrical energy in a motor vehicle. And so therefore we're already seeing that the electrical market in the motor vehicle is dominating that uptake of batteries. But we're going to see this whole change through everything that we do, and some of the uses of batteries we haven't even imagined yet. But in 2016, TTI Group imagined some change. TTI Group, who's that you say? That's not a name. Anybody recognise the name TTI in the audience? No. Anybody recognise the name Ryobi, Hoover, Milwaukee, and 60% of the world's power tools is TTI Group? And in 2016, they said by 2019, all of the tools we make across our entire range and all of our brands will be available as a battery operation. If it's corded, the AC corded, it'll be available as a battery. If it's powered by a combustion engine, it will be available as a battery. If it's powered by your hand, it will be available as a battery. So secateurs are coming battery operated now, which is great news for those of us that might be getting a little bit arthritic and need to still prune the roses. So if we think about what that looks like, what they've done is in fact in 2018, they've already delivered it, a year earlier than they planned. All of their power tool range is now available as a 40 volt or an 18 volt battery system. That's an incredible change. So your tradie, when he turns up now, or she turns up now, is going to walk in with their uncorded power tool, with their uncorded brick saw, with their uncorded hedge cutter, and this is the way they'll operate. And very soon, every local government on the planet will only be buying electric power tools, changing the way that they operate. And even bearded professors buying electric chainsaws. I took proud delivery of my Ryobi electric chainsaw only last week, and it was terrific. Lasted the whole cut. I didn't have any range anxiety, and it just worked. It was brilliant. And as we assemble this, we're actually doing this right over. We all know that there's a battery in your iPhone, but when you actually add it up, there's already 2 gigawatt hours of storage in the accumulated iPhones on the planet that are still in service. If you added up all the iPhones that have been built, you'll get up to about 10 gigs of energy already built in iPhones. If you want to add up all the smartphones in the world, you'll get up to about 42 gigs of energy just in mobile device phones. So, and then we're going to add layers on this. There's going to be robots. The robots aren't going to be plugged into the wall. They're going to be mobile as well. And then we're going to add farm tools. And we're going to stop using diesel on farms because they'll be electric. They'll be electric charged by solar. The farmer will be getting the solar off of their own farm, and they'll be delivering their energy when they want it. And the other thing that happens with all this distributed energy is everything else gets distributed too. The reason that these little drones and even the ground-based drones are smaller is because we'll go to smaller componentry on farms. The reason we went big was that drivers were expensive and not always available. But once they're not, we'll go to smaller distributed agriculture, just as we'll go to smaller distributed mining and purpose-built mining. All of this will dominate. And on the right-hand side is a glasshouse from a place called Sundrop Farms, which grows about 60% of Australia's tomatoes, solar-powered nursery with a solar-powered D-cell plant and with solar-powered robotics helping the workers do what they do. All of this is going to start, though, particularly in the electric car industry, because that's the place where the energy price is, in fact, much higher than the domestic consumption price. So the cost of an electric car is about 1/3 in terms of energy, about 1/3 the price of fuel. So there is an economic incentive to get there, if only we can get the battery componentry right. This is a plot from 2011 showing you in the light green is hybrid cars. They really haven't taken off. We haven't found hybrids are popular. I believe hybrids will quickly disappear. We've started to go to plug-in hybrids, which is the middle stage of the green. And that's also, in my view, not going to be that popular, because at the end of the day, a simple battery electric vehicle is simpler. There's only about 40 components to an electric engine and the componentry that's associated with it, as opposed to a combustion engine, which has 1,800 components. So the simplification of a battery electric vehicle will, in my view, completely overwhelm the simplification of everything. Can we change the car industry? We already have. Back at the GFC, in 1 year we dropped 8 million units of production in a year, and in the following year we lifted in 16 million units of production. The car industry itself is extraordinarily flexible. If we want to turn off a production line, we do. If we want to ramp it up, we just, put up the pace a bit. That's exactly what Elon's trying to do at the moment. But the point is that there is an innate flexibility of the car industry. At the end of the day, when a car comes off a production line, it's just a car. It might have a combustion engine drivetrain, or it might have an electrical drivetrain, but it's actually still just a car. So, can the car industry change? My view is yes. When will that happen? My expectation is way ahead of most others, apart from Tony Seba, who cracked a mention yesterday, and my view is that the real change starts at the end of this decade, only 2 years away. We will start to see a non-linear transition in the car industry. Anybody that thinks that the linear transition will take this long isn't looking at the way things work. Anybody that tells you this will be a linear transition simply is not reflecting the reality of how economic change happens. So if we look at that was the electrification of the industry. The other convergent factor, which is separate and different and independent, but still related, is autonomy. You can have autonomous petrol cars. You can have autonomous electric cars. But if you're going to swap your fleet to an electric car, why wouldn't you also swap it to an autonomous car at the same time? Or vice versa. If you're going to swap your fleet to an autonomous car, won't you just simply embrace electrical drivetrains at the same time? If all that happens and comes true as I suggest it will, we'll see a collapse of car ownership as a resulting use of car sharing and ride sharing. And this is actually just a 6% per annum erosion of car use. And even at 6%, that translates to an absolutely gobsmacking rate of change. Tony Seba suggests it will be, I'm only saying about 1 in 20. Tony Seba's saying 4 in 5 cars will change. He's saying that this market will collapse far faster. Nobody believes Tony. I do, actually. I think he's right. I'm just using more conservative figures so people might even just have some hope of believing me. And if you translate that then to electric vehicles, then that also translates to an electrification of the fleet that sees an almost complete electrification of the global fleet of all world vehicles by 2040. That will be battery operated, but it won't be big as we quite expected because we'll be using rideshare and car share in a different way that means car ownership itself will fall. Nevertheless, we'll see a diminishment of the use of oil and we'll see an increase in the use of electricity as a consequence. You can see I've got a shaped curve here. I've got EVs dominating the initial part of the storage market because that's where it makes economic sense to do it. But ultimately, as batteries get cheaper and cheaper, there's a lot more houses and we'll start to use battery storage in houses, and so we'll see this invasion of electrical storage behind the meter. I've shown you that slide before. I don't know why I got it back. Must be a good slide. And all this convergence adds up because the digitalisation, the battery operation, the mobility that brings, the convergence of all these other technologies starts to reshape the way that we manage stuff. It goes all the way to cities. And you can see this old Google map with the red dots showing where traffic might be. Social media has started to help us manage traffic. It's not traffic lights, it's not road signs from the MRD, it's actually social media data that's improving the way that our roads operate. We no longer see as many road counters on the road. In fact, when we do, I actually wonder what the hell they're doing because all this digital data's out there. Why would you stick down something on the road that is going to take you 3 weeks to analyse when it's there instantly on your computer? But we're a bit worried about things appearing where they're not meant to be, especially trucks. Here's an accident that's waiting to happen. On the road to success, there are no shortcuts. In a future of vehicle autonomy, that will never happen unless the data set is wrong. And if it does happen, it will only ever happen once because then the data set will improve. I've shown you this slide before too. It's really popular, showing all the different things that are incorporating in the Ag department. I might talk shorter than I imagined. Can we do it? We've built lots of solar. We've actually ramped up from virtually 0 to 90 gigs of production of capacity of solar every last year, and that will be 100 this year. It will continue to ramp. So can we produce that many batteries? And the answer is, yeah, sure, why not? It's just a commodity. We just have to build it. We've got to dig up a few rocks. We're good at that. How many rocks is that, Ray? I'm glad you asked. So if my forecasts are right, then we're going to see this kind of distribution of demand for lithium and, of course, all the associated minerals. Now, just to put this into perspective, I'm saying 2.2 million tonnes of lithium metal, which, of course, is a non-existent substance by itself, but, you know, that's how we're measuring it. Everybody else is saying about, well, 600 or 700 1,000 tonnes by that time, so I'm about 4 or 5 times ahead of everybody else. But everybody else has been doubling their forecast for the last 3 years and mine have stayed the same. So they're slowly catching me. How can that happen? So 2.2 million tonnes of lithium translates to be about 200 million tonnes of ore. It's a lot of ore. Have we made that much ore before? Not sure. Iron ore. Iron ore. Australia took iron ore production from 200 million tonnes to 800 million tonnes in 10 years. 600 million tonnes of ore, 3 times the amount of lithium that we need in terms of ore. Australia's already good at ramping up hard rock mining. And our challenge as an industry that used to be, if you forgive the phrase, a tier 3 industry, where we were really hardly, as Ivor said earlier, rarely were we even counting the lithium, to a point where this century lithium is an economy critical metal. Lithium will be fundamental to everything we do because everything we do will be digital and mobile. And hey, it's the world's lightest metal, so you know what can go wrong, apart from a few other things. So that takes your share from where it was to where it will be, and as you can see, battery consumption will simply dominate lithium by 2025, in my view. At that point, EVs, but ultimately behind them, battery storage will become the new user. We did a whole pile of analytics on this with my company FutureSmart. This is our report for AMEC that we did earlier this year, and we looked at the distribution in green of Australia and the white of rest of the world. And Australia does really well in the making big rocks into small rocks category. But after that, we get a bit poor. And that's really what the lithium value chain expansion is about. How do we move downstream to actually capture what in 2017 was a $120 billion market? How do we avoid the leakages that Tim Shanahan talked about before the break? How do we actually turn this in 2025 into something that Australia can be a part of? Our January report estimated a $1.3 trillion potential by 2025 globally. We revised that figure shortly after the report came out to be $2 trillion. We're currently revising that forecast now to be well into double digits, if we do the whole of the value chain. So then it's a question of whether we can capture it. Okay, so let me click this button and move on. This shows you where that processing's happening. You can see that Australia, green, really good on those making big rocks into small rocks. Not much else happening. We need to change that. And then we actually think about all those other reserves that we actually have in Australia, and this is just another couple of charts on nickel and cobalt. Yeah, we've got a bit of that stuff, so let's summarise. If we were to count up all the battery resources that we had, and we were to stick it in a stack, and we ask where did it occur, the answer is Australia. All the battery resources. 10 out of 10. Now, if you were to add Africa up in those same columns, given it was a single jurisdiction, Africa would be competing with Australia. But Africa is not a single jurisdiction. If you're talking about certainty of supply and sovereign risk, then Australia is the logical place to be. What does that translate like in terms of investment? The more we scale up, the more volume we have, the cheaper things get, the cheaper they get, the more of these we can build for lower dollars. And my view is that the bars represent expenditure, the curves represent annual growth, and in my view, batteries really start to accelerate post-2020. And it starts to look like that shape of curve, which takes us even further into the future, but I'm out of time, so I'm not going to talk about that. In talking about capacity, you have to talk about generation and how it's delivered, and you can see that solar, while it's going to be bigger in capacity, is still not going to be bigger in generation, because solar has a lower capacity factor than wind, and batteries are always available, so batteries will effectively have even though they're just stored energy, of course, they'll have a higher capacity, and you can see also my intrusion of solar thermal into 2030 as well. And then that starts to reshape how the world's energy is used with an acceleration of renewables that hasn't yet started. My view is renewables start to accelerate next decade. How do we actually map this space? We've got to think about it. And so that's the primary challenge. How do we know when we've left the asymptote? How do we know when we've accelerated? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question and leave this. Here's a shopping list for later. You'll get the slide set. I won't talk about it now. It just simply gives a summary of what I've been through. Thanks for listening.